We're back. I'm pleased to say we're continuing this really important conversation with two of the most creative forces on our side in the war of ideas against the Chinese Communist Party. The great Chris Chappell and his staff writer Shelley Zhang of China Uncensored. And we're talking about the challenges of countering the Chinese Communist Party at the intellectual level. And I want to ask you, Shelley, to talk a little bit about whether the Biden administration actually understands the nature of and the extent to which we are at war with the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, I think one of the things that's happening with the Biden administration is that it's not quite clear whether they understand at a fundamental level the threat of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the things that set the Trump administration apart a little bit. Like you saw, the State Department under Mike Pompeo was very clear about naming the Chinese Communist Party specifically as a threat, talking about how this is not about China or Chinese people. It's not as clear to me whether they understand what the Chinese Communist Party is actually doing. And like Chris mentioned earlier, how they consider themselves at war with us.
You may be right that there's a misunderstanding going on here, but it seems to me it may be explained by something else. I have the feeling it has to do with the compromise of, well, not just the president, but many of his senior subordinates, affecting both their understanding, perhaps, but certainly their policies. And I want to talk to you about specifically one of the perilous pieces of this, and that is that we may, it seems, on the basis, among other things, of your terrific reporting about what the Chinese are up to in the South China Sea, the Solomon Islands now, and perhaps against Taiwan, moving from the kind of unrestricted warfare in the economic space, political space, the information operation space, into the kinetic, that is to say, old fashioned warfare of the military kind. Talk, if you would, a little bit about how close you think we may be to witnessing the Chinese communists actually moving militarily against us.
This really is an existential threat to the United States. China has been rapidly modernizing its military. And as you can see in the South China Sea, China claims basically the entire South China Sea, where $5 trillion of shipping goes through. There's untapped oil and natural gas reserves, and China has been building artificial islands in this body of water, claiming it as territory. The United States told uh, the Chinese Communist Party under the Obama administration to stop building these islands. They did
They
not.
they promised to stop
They actually
militarizing those
did. They
islands. Yeah.
promised to.
hmm
Right, Shell.
And now, recently, a U.S. admiral has said that at least three of those islands are now fully militarized, and then any plane flying over the region could be within Chinese missile range.
Anti aircraft missiles, that is, of course. And to what extent are the other kinds of weapons that they're putting on these bastions, Chris, actually designed to project power broadly over the region as well?
Absolutely. China's goal is to control, at first, the Asia Pacific. With the South China Sea, and if it successfully invades Taiwan, it will have a pretty ironclad grip on the region. And then that gives China the ability to essentially
Project power
project power,
into the rest of the Pacific.
as well as, I think, be able to sanction the United States. Like, imagine America not being able to get medicine. Most of our medicine is made in China.
I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, the Solomon Islands, there's a lot of concern right now over China having this secret security pact with the Solomon Islands that might get them a military base in the Solomon Islands. And it's one of those things that seems easy to dismiss because you can say, oh, well, they're not going to do that. Like, that's too extreme. But as we can see with what's happened in the South China Sea, they will take decades, if necessary, to slowly build up their strength in an area. And if they get a military base in the South Pacific, that's a way to cut off Australia from the US. It is a way to cut off shipping. It is a way to cut off trade. If it came down to kinetic warfare, they could isolate Australia. So this is pretty dangerous. And it's something that when you talk about it, it seems extreme maybe to people who aren't really paying attention to how quickly this can happen and what they're doing. But it's important to pay attention to.
Let me round this point out a little bit further because it seems increasingly the Chinese are interested in projecting power far beyond the Western Pacific. Specifically, you've done a very important program about what inroads they're making in China at the moment. Talk, if you would, about the Belt and Road Initiative, of which Africa is, of course, a very important part. Um, are we seeing them putting in place infrastructure and other capabilities that will enable them, in fact, to project power globally?
Well, essentially, we're in another Cold War, and we see the world beginning to divide into two camps. One's tied to liberal democracies, and others tied to authoritarian powers. China is leading it, Russia is a part of it as well. But China is essentially using the Belt and Road, promising infrastructure investment in developing countries, particularly in Africa, as a way to essentially buy them off to get them on their side in things like the United Nations.
They're able to exploit a lot of countries that have not much development, but they have a lot of natural resources, minerals, um, timber, agriculture that China might need. So they go into the Congo and
Markets.
yeah, and they go into the Congo and use child labor to mine for cobalt, right?
To
Uh,
make the solar panels that we all use.
they will
Part of our
go,
Green New
yeah,
Deal, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
And I think the thing is that like we think of in the West, we think of imperialism or nationalism as things that only the West can do in a way. Like we don't pay attention to what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. People in Africa have called it a new kind of colonialism, and
Yes,
it is
rightly
something.
so.
We were just talking about the Solomon Islands. This is exactly what they've done in the Solomon Islands, which is, you know, exploit their natural resources, bring in Chinese companies, bring in Chinese labor, so even the local economy can't benefit from what they're doing.
Right.
And we see in Africa places like Djibouti, where they now have their first military base. It's an official military base outside of China, and recently,
Adjacent to one of ours, interestingly enough. Um, Let me ask you about this phenomenon of the payday loans that are used to, well, effectively, I think, enslave the people who are making these, in some cases, extremely important strategic areas and resources available to the Chinese Communist Party.
I mean, you just have to look at what happened with Sri Lanka with their, they could not pay back the loans and they essentially had to give up a port to
Right.
a 99-year lease to the Chinese Communist
Yeah.
Party.
Which could be another military base down the line for China.
In fact, I've been told an entire state of South Africa has been turned over to them for 99 years on this basis. Let me turn, in closing, to one last topic that you have been doing some tremendous reporting on, the use by the Chinese Communist Party of the so called COVID-19 pandemic. I'm interested in your assessment of the extent to which the Chinese have been able to turn this to advantage to them and obviously to the great detriment of others. Um, as one might think of it as a sort of biological warfare attack from them would do. Do you think that they have on net advantaged themselves from it, and to what extent?
Well, the coronavirus definitely gave us proof of just how much power the Chinese Communist Party has over global medical supplies. They covered up the virus to hoard medical supplies. They nationalized U.S. companies in China, like 3M, uh, basically preventing them from exporting PPEs to the United States. Um,
Chris, my apologies. I've asked you a question that requires a long answer and we don't have time for it today. We're going to have you back to get into this in much greater detail. I appreciate so much your time and all the work that you and Shelley do with your team at China Uncensored. I look forward to a visit with you very soon. Next up, we're going to talk with Saleh Hudayar, a Uyghur activist and patriot, about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to his people right after this.